What's up, Marcy Cookies? My name is Paula, and on this channel I'm sharing all of the tips and knowledge that I can with all of the young aspiring artists who want to make it in this industry. And if you click on this video, I'm guessing you're either making your webcomic already or planning to start very soon. So it's a smart thing that you clicked. Now, if you've been on this channel for a while, then you already know that I'm a professional animation and visual effects producer, and I've been working in this industry for almost a decade now. Wow. I worked on many animation and visual effects projects, worked on big projects and big studios, and I'm here to share all of my experience with you guys. But did you know that I'm also a very first comic book published author in Kazakhstan? I know this might seem crazy, but I've published my very first comic book in Kazakhstan in 2010, which if you grew up with comic books, it might sound kind of crazy and insane that in 2010 there has been a very first comic book published. But in Kazakhstan, we didn't have any companies publishing comic books at this point. And so yours truly published her very first one in that time. And so ever since I started working on this comic in 2008, and this is when my relationship with storytelling and particularly comic books industry started. We didn't have any manga or comics back then. All we had was imported stuff, mainly from the States. Back in that time, you didn't have platforms like Webtoons or other webcomic platforms to read your comics. All we had was few translated Marvel comics in the stores. And then slowly some American and Japanese comic books started to find a way to Kazakhstan, but they were no original artists. And of course, therefore, there was nobody teaching or explaining how the whole thing works. Honestly, back in that time, I just winged the whole thing. Keep in mind that back in that time, tablets have only started to show up. It wasn't really a thing yet, especially in Kazakhstan. And so actually for this particular comic, I actually ended up drawing the whole thing with a freaking pencil. And of course, after I was done, I put it together in Photoshop. I basically just darkened the layers. I know, guys, this doesn't look very impressive. It is painful to see, especially considering that like even those lines I actually had to draw by hand with my pencil and a ruler, because again, tools were not there. It wasn't taught on YouTube or anywhere else. But even so, I'm just proud that I finished that project and it got published, and some people actually liked it. So that was my very first experience. It's crazy to think that I've been working on this in 2008, but luckily for you, today we have YouTube and other platforms like Skillshare that actually teach you all of those things. There are many translated and original books on how to make a comic book. But here's the thing, while there is a ton of information out there in the internet now, this presents a different kind of problem. When you are really pumped and you want to start working on your comic book, you need to learn an efficient process. All of those books and resources are very helpful and you should look into them too. But I think that if you just want to get started or understand the process, this video is definitely for you. So now that I worked in the industry for some time and I've got a lot of experience and I finally understand how things work, finally break it down for you in a way that is actually understandable and makes sense and the most efficient way that you can get your comic done. Let me paint you a picture. What happens a lot nowadays is a young artist gets really inspired, but maybe she read a story that really inspired her, maybe she watched a movie, maybe she came up with an OC that feels so cool and she really wishes that this OC had a story. Or maybe she thought about a catch, a hook for the story. And she was like, oh wow, if there would be a story about the, I don't know, love of a demon and an angel. And that's where the whole thing starts rolling. But mistake that a lot of artists make is because they're so pumped up and they really want to tell the story, they jump right in and they just start drawing it without following certain steps that are super important. And if you want to set up your comic for success, if you actually want the story to go through, if you want to take it somewhere, if you're serious about it, and you've got the passion, then let me break down the process for you properly so that you don't end up like her and don't end up quitting after 2 weeks. So at this point, you probably have heard about comic production. In its traditional state, a company would have many artists with a different hierarchy. Some of them are assistants, they all have different roles working on a comic book. It is still true nowadays as well, and there are many companies like that producing webtoons, both in Asia and the US. It's still the case that are working on traditional manga and comics. Even single authors that are working on their comic book, especially on things like, if you know Webtoon, they have their originals and they have many artists that are mainly working on their comic. Even they do have their own assistant and they have people that are helping them to get the production faster. And in every professional production, there are stages, something that we call in the industry production pipeline. And today I'm gonna teach you that pipeline so that you can apply it and you can use it too. And the best part is that maybe if 10 years ago it was very difficult for a single artist to create their very own comic book and get any success, today not only is it possible, but we do have so many emerging tools that can be actually very helpful for you. So if you learn and understand all of the steps of production pipeline, you will have an advantage and the best chance of succeeding as a comic artist. So in the production, we have 3 stages: pre-production, production, and post-production. Those 3 stages are crucial. They also differ from industry to industry, and they also differ from house to house. But today we're just gonna cover the basics that will be helpful particularly to. So before you even start sketching or do any drawing whatsoever, you have to, absolutely have to know your story. Particularly, where does it start, where does it go, and where does it end? Way too many artists start their story with just a hook, an idea that they had, like, what if, I don't know, a demon and an angel were in love? And they start there, but the problem is they don't actually know what the story is about and where it ends. Before you ever start drawing your comic book, make sure to know where does your story start, what's the journey, general journey. You don't have to know all of the details, but you have to get a good idea of what the story is about. And then where does it end? For example, I know for a fact that whenever you're pitching your story to Webtoons to be an original, the very first thing they're gonna ask you is, what's the story about, where it starts, and where does it end? They want to make sure that as an author, you know where it ends, because that's already part of success. We want to know that your story has an arc, that it's a journey. No viewer want to start a journey if there is no ending to it, right? And what happens way too many times is artists start their comic, they're excited, they start drawing it, but the problem is they don't know where it ends. And because of that, too many times, their story just doesn't make sense. Because what happens is they try to string it along, they're trying to figure out what's going on in their own story, and they don't know how to finish it. And so, of course, it doesn't make sense. So if you've got an idea, then make sure to know the journey. You don't have to think about every episode, but you just need to know a general direction. For example, imagine if we were watching Harry Potter and all of the films and the whole story, right? And then by the very end, in the end, like the very last chapter, all of a sudden there is some random character that like never made sense, just suddenly showed up and becomes the main villain. And then Harry defeats him and that's it, it's done. A happy ending, right? It wouldn't make sense because this character is clearly just there to fill the hole because there is no ending. This is just a fictional scenario so that you would understand that because in Harry Potter everything is built quite well from a beginning to the end. There is actually a story, there is a character arc, there is an arc of the whole world and everything revolves around it. So we as viewer feel satisfied because we've seen the journey, we've seen where it started, how it went, how he grew as a character, how characters around him grew and changed, and they feel familiar to us because we watched their journey and it ended very harmoniously because of that. And if you just really want to make a comic but you don't know what's the hook, you don't know what to make the story about, one of the storytelling tricks I've learned from the cinema world is you can think about ideas in terms of what if. What if an angel fell in love with a demon? And you go from there. If an artist who, I don't know, been passionate about art his whole life and he finally became famous, suddenly got blind. Because most of the best stories became with what if. What if one day a boy find out that he's a wizard and he belongs to this magical world, Harry Potter, right? What if the world is surrounded by pirates and there's a treasure and the whole world is built around it? One Piece, at least the way I see it. What if we all live in a simulation and none of this is actually real? Matrix. Pretty much any kind of story that you can think of began with what if. And when you're writing your story, an advice I can give you that I have heard from so many comic book artist friends, and it's not even as much of advice as it's something that they wish they've done when they just got started. If you're starting for the first time, try to start with a short story. Because as tempting as it is to make a really long series, what tends to happen is a lot of artists underestimate how long it's going to take to tell this story, even when it's a short story. But if your story is very long, you would have to be very committed. Because making comic books is freaking hard. It does take commitment. You should be really passionate about your story. And that's another point. So try to keep your story short if possible. Because this way, first, you would get more experience from actually doing it and actually trying it, and then your next story would be much better. Make sure you're really passionate about your story. Because making a comic is so freaking hard. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of commitment. And the thing is, if you're in it for the money, you wanna consider other options first. Because honestly, most of us, when we do comics, we do that for the passion. The monetization part, it is possible. Yes, you can make living as a comic artist, but that's definitely not something that's gonna come fast. And today with online publishing, I would say it's not even guaranteed. So in order to make this story, in order to be consistent, to actually tell this story, you have to be really committed and therefore very passionate about the story. Otherwise, you're gonna burn up really quickly. And let me tell you, creative burnout is no joke. A lot of comic artists, especially comic artists, face this problem. Even once they get paid by big platforms like Webtoon. And if you consider that, if even professional comic artists who actually get paid regularly for their work now and demotivated like this, imagine how easy it would be for you to get burnout, considering that it is very likely that you're not gonna see any money coming from the comic very soon. But if you are really passionate, if you do really love your story, love your characters, you really wanna tell it and share it with the world, that's the best motivation you can get. That's the thing that's gonna keep pushing you forward when you're tired, when you don't feel like it. This is the thing that's gonna keep pushing you forward. That, and also kind comments from the viewers, which I do recommend you to save, by the way. Whenever you get nice comments, try to save them and look at them, because this is gonna be an extra push to motivate you in your process. And while you are working on your story, something I do recommend is, especially if you don't have a storytelling background, you don't have an education in a similar studies, I do recommend you do some research and some education on your own. Learn more about storytelling, learn more about character development, character arc, where the story goes, the twist that you can take, all of those things, the rules of the genre and things like that. Learn all about protagonist, antagonist, the relationship, all of those things. Because if you do, or at least if you cover the basics, that's going to help you in the long run, because then your story will make sense, your characters will have a believable presence. And another thing that is important is you will learn how to tell your story by showing it. And you don't have to look into how to write stories for a webtoon or webcomic. Just look into storytelling in general. Look for resources that teach you how to write books and stories and novels. I am personally subscribed to a few channels just because I like to stay up to date, and I think it's important to renew your education when you can. And the same thing goes even if you say have some experience with storytelling, but you are approaching a genre that is not familiar to you. That's the time to upgrade your education and learn more. And you don't even have to pay for it, just learn on YouTube. But if you're brand new and you want to know more about storytelling basics, the book I recommend to everyone is Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. I've read it multiple times. Of course, now the time has moved on and some things have updated, but the basics are still there and they're still very useful. So I highly recommend you give it a read. Or if you're like me, do audiobooks while you draw. It's very convenient and saves a lot of time. Once you figure out your story, next thing is your characters. And I'm not just talking about character design, that thing comes later. First, what you want to focus on is your actual character development. Because believe me, even the most beautifully designed character with all of the accessories, the unique look, everything, cannot make up for the absence of the good character development. First, what you should do is write your characters out. What I like to do is have a document with all of my characters written out, kind of like a little, you can say, profile or dossier, where I've got their names, their age, where are they from, their background, just kind of like a short description of everything. Then I have a description of their personality, their strengths, their weaknesses, what do they want and what do they actually need. What the wants and the needs are the most important for your main character. You don't have to have them like all of those details written out for every single character, but I would definitely have that for your main character and maybe a few supporting or secondary characters that you have. For example, if you have a love story and you need more developed character there, like you have A and lover B, you do need to have their backgrounds and their wants and needs written out as well. But if you only have a one protagonist, the one main character, then you can just focus on them. So you should have their backstory. You should know where are they from, where did they grow up, what is their past, where have they been, and what kind of life they've been living until the point of your story. Because the more you understand the characters that you're playing with, because essentially it's kind of like putting them in a situation, the more you understand them, how they're going to be reacting to each other, the situations they're going to be in as well. And at this point, if you want, you can start putting down some character designs, you can start doing some sketches, think about what they would look like. But even when doing character designs, keep in mind who your characters are. Keep in mind their characters' development, their profile. Because you don't want to have inconsistency and randomness when it comes to your character design versus their personality. For example, if you have a very broomy, brutal guy who is dark and mysterious and all of those things, especially like in a romantic setting, you wouldn't want to design him with some like adorable clothes unless there is a reason for it. Unless, I don't know, he's crazy, like Harley Quinn kind of crazy, where he's a murderer but at the same time like he loves the cute stuff, you know, like unless there is a reason for it in his character and his story. So don't just put together some random designs and think, oh, this character looks cool, I'm gonna make him this character. Like, make sure that their visual presentation actually makes sense for the character that you have developed. Okay, so now if you've got your story, you've got your character development down, and you're starting to scribble and like think about the character design, now is the time to decide what is your comic book style is gonna look like. And I'm talking about art style here, all of the colors. If you're gonna use any colors, that's another thing that you need to decide. You should really think about what kind of style would benefit your story and would make sense for your genre and the story that you're trying to tell. You already know that there is American comic style, there is a manga, anime, there is American comic book style throughout the different generations and ages, and all of those are valid and you could use any of those. But also it's not like you have to necessarily follow those set of rules and those styles. You can very much do your very own. The most important thing is to decide on a style and set up your very own rules and see what it looks like. For that, I recommend checking out other comics. There are many of them online, and see what kind of genres and what kind of stories you'd use what kind of style. And of course, if you as an artist have a certain style that you prefer, you can also use that. But a lot of times it depends as well, because for example, if you are just starting out with comic and you haven't really worked in a more graphic kind of style. For example, if you only used watercolor before, or maybe you've used semi-realistic style before, it can be a little bit challenging because you would have to see if that style fits your story. But also important part is to make sure it's not too complicated for you to actually go through with a story. I generally recommend everyone who is starting out to try to keep your style simple, especially if you're gonna work in colors. It's time consuming, so you really wanna make sure that when you pick the style, you're going for something that you can actually work on for a long time, because you will be drawing those characters again and again for a very long time. So you better pick the style that is sustainable for you. So for example of this video, I'm actually gonna use my very own comics. A few years back, I believe in 2018, I've been working on a comedy, slice of life comedy webtoon comic, and I purposely chose a very sweet, fluffy, but also very simple art style for it, because not only because it was simple and it was sustainable for me to make, but also because this style benefited the genre of the comic. The exaggerations that I could use with this style really brought out the cuteness and the funny scenes that I was trying to show. The cuteness and comical side of the style really brought out the moments that I was trying to show. Especially when it came to expressions or some jokes, it really benefited my comic, and that's what you want to look for. On the other hand, the experiment I'm currently conducting, and I'm just calling it an experiment because it is generally crazy. I do not recommend any artist do the thing I did. I have recently started publishing my new webtoon. It's called The Blue Blood. I am in love with the story. I want to tell it so bad. But because if you follow me on Instagram, you know that my style is semi-realistic digital painting. Ever since I started using iPad to draw, I really enjoy semi-realistic style. So that's the kind of illustrations I've been creating. And when I came up with this story, I really wanted it to feel like a movie, okay? And I was thinking like, how can I show this as a movie when I so clearly see it like a movie? And then I've decided, okay, my style is semi-realistic, which makes it kind of like the movie if I do the right thing. If I actually make it somewhat believable. And I knew, the thing is, I knew what I was signing up for. I knew that it was gonna be way harder to do than any other comic I've ever done. So no surprise there. I'm just telling you that do not do this, especially if this is your first time. You can check that comic out. I'll leave a link to my webtoon in the comments below. But basically, I started a comic in a semi-realistic style. It is crazy. I spent so much time on every single episode. But the problem with this, and something again, I knew what I was going for. I knew that this would be the thing because I looked at it as an experiment. So just so you know, that's why I'm explaining this, so that you can learn and understand the process I had behind it. I knew that this will take me way longer. I knew that because it takes me so much longer, it will be way harder to grow an audience. That's another thing that you need to keep in mind. If you cannot publish episodes consistently or often enough, you're risking not getting discovered, and less people will be following your comic. But in this case, I did want to tell it in this specific style, so I knew that this would be the result. And I'm just being stubborn, and I'm just publishing the new episodes when I finally finish them, basically. But I do not recommend doing that. You can, but I don't recommend it. Demonstration of this video, I will actually be using another comic that I've been working on. It's not published yet, it is coming in the future, but it is much more simple. The style for it is much more simplified, especially compared to the crazy semi-realistic one I have. I'm not gonna name the name of the comic just yet because it hasn't been published, but if it has been published at this point, you can also find a link down below. Now that you've decided with your style, you can really go ahead and go crazy with your character designs. But again, I do highly recommend to keep it simple. You want to make sure that you can basically tell your characters apart from each other so they don't look too similar, especially if it's like a love triangle thing. You don't want that main character, let it be girl or boy, and then the two love interests looking similar, because then it would confuse the hell out of viewer. But generally try to keep, especially when it comes to like your main cast, try to keep them unique, keep them recognizable so that the viewer can see and tell them apart. Especially if you're working in something like anime manga style, you really need to make sure that people can tell characters apart. And especially if it's a black and white comic. Because I cannot tell you how many times I've heard viewers complaining about the author choosing to have a few characters that look too similar, especially in a black and white comic, and the audience just couldn't tell them apart, and it was very confusing for the story. So at this stage, you haven't drawn a comic book episode yet. So it's a perfect time to prevent this problem from happening and design the characters that look different from each other. You do want to try to keep your characters simple though, and what I mean by that is you don't want to give them too much details, especially when it comes to clothes and accessories. Because while it's fun when you're drawing an illustration, it might be fun to draw pretty clothes and all of the accessories and make them look cool and unique and like all of those awesome things. When it comes to comic, you're gonna have to draw this a lot. You will have so many panels with this same character, and if you give them clothes that are too complicated with a lot of accessories, you're not gonna be happy with your decision, believe me. So just try to keep them simple. But then again, if you can find a way around it, for example, if you can make your own custom brush that will help you with those accessories, like I don't know, a bracelet brush or something. I've used this in my comic as well. Then you can consider that, because like if you have a too complicated tattoos or accessories or clothes, that's gonna take a lot of your time and you will regret it quickly if you don't find a workaround or if you just don't choose a simpler design. And this leads me to the last part of pre-production process, writing your script. So at this point you should already have a pretty good idea of your story. You should know what direction it's gonna take, where it's gonna end, as well as where it's gonna begin. And you should also have a document describing your characters, their character arc, and things like that. And now it's time to get specific. And of course, like in any other production, and comics is not an exception, everyone have a different process when it comes to script. There are artists who like to have a general script and then more details. There are artists that write it out right before they draw the comic. Everybody's process is different. But here is what I do. Because I feel like as creative people, if we write out the whole story, the whole script, and we know everything that's gonna happen, we're gonna lose excitement. Because in a sense, we are excited about watching the story come to life. For me personally, that's the case. If I have a script for the whole thing, I will lose excitement very quickly, and I will feel like drawing it is actually a chore since I already know everything that is going to happen. So what I personally like to do is I like to have a separate document where I write out episodes outlines. So basically I will have each episode, and then I'll have bullet points of everything that is happening during this episode. This is very useful because this gives me a direction and understanding where my story is going. It doesn't describe every single thing that is happening, only the main key points of what is going on in this episode. Character A meets character B for the first time, or character A gets in a fight with this person, and then a friend of character A gets in trouble. Things like that. And then this is very convenient because at some point, if you suddenly get inspiration or if you decide to switch things around, you can actually just move them around in that very document. And then visually it will be more convenient for you to just move it around and see what you can edit and add in there. And then I have another document, which is basically the script. There I write everything that's going on, the action, and then dialogues, everything that is happening in every single episode. But I don't write all of the episodes in advance. What I like to do is I will write 1, 2, maybe 3 episodes at most as a script, and then I start drawing. And so I will actually write the new script every 1 to 3 episodes or so. This way it still keeps things for me fresh, but also the reason I usually try to bulk it and write like from 1 to 3 episodes as a script is because this way when I'm writing, I'm in a zone. I'm feeling the story, I'm imagining it, and if I just let my flow go and I keep writing until say 3 episodes, I will be more productive this way. And then I get to drawing, and then if I feel like it makes sense to add something to the future episode, I just add it in the script. Yay! Congratulations! If you have all of these things, that means your pre-production process is done. Congratulations! You took the first step, and now we can actually talk about production. But before you get excited, grab your pencil and hysterically start drawing the new episode. Let me stop you right there because there is one more thing that I have to mention. Before you actually start drawing the episodes, you need to decide what is going to be your main format for the comic. Nowadays, with the existing of the online world, there is many formats that comic take. There is a classical 2-page spread of the comic, like this one over here, this is technically a manga, and those usually are published with a similar layout where you have this one page posted and then you have all of these windows on the same screen. That is gonna highly depend on how you want to tell your story and where you want to publish it. That's how soon or if you ever want to print it. Another option for many artists is to either have your own website and have it published there, or you can have it on your social media. And then on social media, again, you have to think about what social media is it. If you're publishing, say, on Instagram, you would have to think, am I publishing it as a reel, so it would be more of a vertical format, or am I publishing it as a post? Because then something closer to a square or like a rectangular, which is not as tall as reels are, you would have to really think about what kind of measures you're talking about before you start drawing. And that doesn't mean that if you just choose one now, you can never reformat it. And like if you're choosing, let's say, a classical 2-page spread, that doesn't mean that you cannot turn it into a Webtoon or post it on Instagram. The reason I'm asking you to choose the format now is because you have to choose something to start from. And then later on, if you decide, okay, I want to also publish my comic on Webtoon, or I want to also publish my comic on my Instagram account, you can always reformat it. It's just because reformatting takes time, and when you just begin, it's important to choose just one so that you can get started. And then afterwards, you can always adjust it and find a way to reformat it so you can publish it on other platforms. And if you really want to know about all of the ways to publish your webcomic, about all of the platforms, pros and cons of it, I can make a separate video about it. Just let me know if you're interested in the comments below, because there are a lot of details that go into picking the format. And if you're struggling with picking, just let me know. I'll make a video for you just about that. But because I myself really like Webtoon format, the vertical scroll, and that's usually how I draw and format my comic books, for the sake of this video, I will be using a Webtoon example. The reason I like Webtoon format is because it is a vertical scroll. So in many ways, it's kind of like animation because you only get to see one frame at a time when you scroll. So it kind of gives it for me, a similar flow and similar effect, where when you have a 2-page spread and you gotta think about, in this page we see all of these shots, you gotta think about how the human eye is gonna follow it, so it's a little bit different, and I just personally prefer the vertical format. And now, once you've picked your format and you have all of the pre-production steps done and ready, we are ready to actually start drawing and move into production. So now that you have your pre-production ready, we can now move on to the next step of production pipeline, which is, well, production. I do want to mention that when it comes to production pipeline and dividing pre-production, production, post-production, it is always different for every company, and everybody's workflow is quite different, and especially when it comes to comic, because that one is not quite set in stone. If animation have more of a set pre-production, production, and post-production stages, for comics it varies from company to company or from artist to artist. So in here I'm just explaining to you the process the way I break it down for myself and the way that I find it to be more efficient and easier to follow. And I recommend that before you start drawing your very first episode, have at least 2 episodes ready in a script. So you have it written down, you know what's gonna happen, and you know it so that you can just focus on the art, you can focus on the actual visualization of your script. If you haven't dealt with working with a script and then visualizing it, it can be a little bit challenging, especially when you're just starting out. Honestly, I've been doing animation and filmmaking my whole life, and I still find it a little bit challenging every time I'm transitioning what I had in mind in terms of script to the page. And with comics, while I know it can be very tempting to just, when you're starting out and you have a really cool world in mind and maybe you have some background story and a lore, and it can be tempting to just put it all on one page, tall, like a rectangular of text. And a lot of beginners do that, but I'm here to tell you, don't ever do that. Do not, I think they call it text dump. Yeah, do not text dump in your comic book. You can use text, and sometimes it does. That doesn't mean that you cannot use text. You can absolutely use it, you should use it, but what I mean is that instead of relying on text to tell your story, because you're drawing comic book here, right? You're not writing a novel. So we want to stick to images. And even if you have a lot of, for example, if you see one of the comics I've been publishing recently, I like to, if I have a long dialogue, for example, in one of the chapters, I have a teacher talk a lot. And then instead of just having her and giving her a huge bubble, I like to first break this bubble into 2, so it's a smaller amount of text. And then if she's still talking, it's not really interesting for the viewer to just look at her, right? We have to keep the visualization. So I speak 3 languages on daily basis and it messes with my head, so I'm sorry if my pronunciation is weird sometimes. But yeah, I want to talk about visualization of your comic in the very beginning, before you ever start sketching or anything from this board. Points? Key element? In my opinion, it's the key element when it comes to drawing a comic. And even if your style is very simple, which by the way, again, I encourage you to start simple. If you can do simple, especially for your first comic, don't be like me. And again, I suffer greatly from my choices, but I chose it. And even say if your art technique maybe is not completely there, maybe you're still learning. Hell, we're all learning. We're constantly learning, okay? Artists learn all the time, so it's not even a question. But the thing is, if your story is good, you know how to visually bring a viewer into the story, the art doesn't really matter that much. Of course, people will appreciate your artwork, they will appreciate characters, but story always comes first. That's the key point that you should always remember. Story comes first. And the way you tell it, because you might have the most amazing story in the world, you might have a really cool world set up. If you fail to actually show this story in an entertaining way, so that the viewer can actually immerse and can actually imagine, feel for those characters, instead of keep thinking like, okay, wait, why am I reading text for the past 5 minutes, right? You really want to think about how to show it, instead of what are you gonna say or what are you gonna write. And that's a good time to mention that. So I have multiple comics online that you can check out. I think not all of them are public currently, but I do have 2 most recent ones. One haven't been published yet, so spoilers, yeah, spoilers. But I will be sharing this with you guys as a part of my process, because that one is actually much simpler in terms of style. And this way I can show you the process which will be more relevant to you. Because my second comic, which is published. I'm publishing it as much as I can. It's more of an experimental project, because if you guys follow me on Instagram, you know that I love to draw in semi-realistic, crazy fantasy style. And this is the kind of style I chose for my new comic. And that's why I keep telling you, just pick simpler style, because it is taking a toll. It is not easy to do anything even slightly complicated when it comes to comics. And I mean, I knew that because it wasn't my first comic, so I knew that going in, but still, I'm still constantly asking myself, why did I do this to myself? So yeah, don't do this. But if you are curious about, you know, seeing an example in terms of like how I use storytelling, and I actually had a lot of readers tell me that they really appreciate and like the way I tell the story visually. So that's why I'm just saying that you can check it out. My crazy semi-realistic comic is called Blue Blood. And now it's a shameless plug promotion for those of you who likes to read comics and likes to watch illustrations. The Blue Blood tells the story of a girl named Ori, who in the very beginning gets turned into a vampire and gets dragged into the whole vampire world and learns about the whole aspect of vampire society and learns to navigate around it. She is the very first human in a few hundred years to be turned into a vampire against her will. I need a better pitch. Okay, let's try this again.
Snow. Every snowflake is unique. It transforms through its journey to Earth. A journey that leads to unimaginable adventure. What is happening to me? Is this my blood? Every snowflake starts its journey alone. I'm just dreaming. But then something happens. And suddenly snowflakes' paths cross.
That metallic smell. There's been another attack.
They collide.
She's still breathing. It's not too late.
And this collision, that moment when their paths meet, changes everything.
I take it you guys already know that this is going to be a romance and a fantasy and a supernatural vampire story. So if you're interested, check it out. So to make it easier for you guys and make it more relatable, this time around I will be using my new upcoming comic, so you'll get a sneak peek of what I'm working on. Or you know, YouTube is evergreen, maybe it's already out. If it is, link is down below. I have a supernatural dark adult comedy coming out. I'm not gonna tell you the name just yet, but if it is out, then check it, it must be in the description. I've decided to use my newest comic as an example just because my semi-realistic one is very hard to follow in terms of process. Basically because I treat every single panel like an illustration, and my process there wouldn't be necessarily helpful for majority of people who are planning to do comic, since it's absolutely crazy to do a semi-realistic comic. And I wanted to show and not just tell you guys about my process. So that's why I will be using my upcoming comic this time around, where we will go through all of the production process. But if you're interested, and I'm actually seriously thinking about sharing my process with my semi-realistic comic as well in my future upcoming videos. I might even make a video of like the way I made the comic and things like that, so that you guys can have a blueprint of that as well. So once you do have a script for about first 2 episodes, you can now actually move to sketching. The aspect ratio you're going to be using and everything else is going to depend on the format that you choose. Because I prefer making webtoons, I will be showing you my webtoon process, but it's not too different from the rest of them, so you can still follow along. The only real difference in here would be if you're doing a traditional 2-page split, you would have to be thinking about how you're going to position those panels. Some people like to have images that are in between the panels as well, so this is just something that you're gonna have to do some research, get some inspiration, but all in all you would be just probably using the 1-page aspect ratio for that. I will be using the webtoon format. And by the way, when you are working and you're just about to start, once you're done with your sketching phase, always make sure to work in the highest resolution possible, because even though platforms, for example like Webtoon, their aspect ratio is not very high, and they don't require much from you in terms of the image size. But what I like to do is I like to create a very large image sizes, because then in the future I have ability to print it. Maybe I like one of the panels to be a poster, or I want to print the whole comic. And because it's a webtoon, I would have to reformat it and, you know, do some post-production work, do some post work and put it all together so people can read it in a book format. But still, as long as I have it in a high resolution, I'm good. So that's what I recommend you, no matter what format you choose. Always try to work in a high resolution. Okay, so first we start with storyboarding and sketching. Remember how I've told you that it's important to visualize your script? So in order to visualize your script, it is best to first start with a very rough sketches and storyboards. Sketches basically are, you can use them as basic shapes at first to just know. So I put both storyboarding and sketching together because I actually separate those into two categories. So first, because you gotta understand what's gonna happen on your page. You're gonna know what shots are gonna be in there, what characters you see during what time. And it helps, especially in terms of saving time, if you first have a very rough an idea of where this character possibly could be in space and time. You don't have to even make it like a sketch, because sketch still will have some character features and details. No, first you can actually, especially if you don't have a lot of experience transitioning script into a comic, if you're still trying to figure out the best way to position your characters, what panels to use and things like that, to keep your comic visually interesting. So for example, if I have two characters having a dialogue, it would be boring for me to just constantly look at one character, so I want to switch in between them, sometimes even add some backgrounds, sometimes switch between shots, add full shots, close-ups and things like that. And this way I can get an idea of where my characters are, what kind of shots I want to have. And then once I'm satisfied with the way it looks, I can actually start sketching it to see the character itself. And I told you guys that artists have different process of doing these things. This is just my process, and I know that many other comic artists, especially the ones that work by themselves, use that as well. So this is just something that I find more efficient for myself. So after that, I will usually jump into sketching. So usually I like to use a very different color from the line color I'm going to use. So for example, if I'm using a black color or brown, dark brown color line, I like to use blue or pink color to make my sketches, because then I can really clearly see what it's gonna look like. And also because when you're sketching, a lot of times you wanna have two, some people like to have 3 level of sketches. For me, personally, it varies. Sometimes I will do like 2 types of sketches. Sometimes I'll just jump from a final sketch to line right away. But basically, what some artists like to do is they like to have a very rough sketch first, and then more defined sketch, and some people even go way further and make like a cleanup sketch, which I always feel like for me it would be a waste of time. I don't like to do cleanup sketches because I would rather have a line. But some artists like to be very precise, so then they will make a really clean sketch before they go ahead and start doing lining. Again, it just depends on your process, but I just personally find it a little inefficient and a bit of waste of time. Sometimes I will just have one pass of a sketch and then I'll move on to line. So it just depends on your skill, how familiar you are with the shape and everything. Or sometimes I like to clean up as I go, so I will start with a rougher version of the sketch and then it will evolve into a more final sketch. So it just depends on how familiar you are with your tools, how familiar you are with the technique, and then, you know, the more you do it, the better you'll get, the faster you'll be doing this. And something I like to do, especially because I'm doing Webtoon, and as you know, Webtoon is basically a vertical format. So a lot of times you will only get a few panels on a page. And I really like to see the whole thing when I'm working on an episode, so then I can go back quickly and see like, okay, what kind of shots I had here. Sometimes you can even repurpose shots, so then I'll see like, oh, okay, I can repurpose this shot over here and things like that. So that's why during the sketching process, I like to have all of my panels on the same page for the episode, so that I can clearly see them, go back, go forward, and it's just much easier for me. You can actually also do that if you're working on a traditional 2-page split comic as well, but I would say just make sure that you're super organized about it, because it's very easy, since there are so many panels next to each other, it's very easy to get confused. That's why many people still prefer to sketch like 1 page at a time when it comes to traditional comics. And by the way, a little trick that I want to share with you as well here is I like to do 1 stage at a time. So what I like to do is when I'm sketching my comic, instead of, some people like to sketch the page first, then, you know, go through all of the process up until finished page. I like to at least finish the episode with sketches and then go the same way with every single step of the process. But sometimes I will even go ahead and sketch out 2 episodes or 3 episodes like that. Bulk them, basically. This way you will be much faster because you are already in a zone, you're already completing this task, and it will be much quicker for you since you don't need to switch between tools or anything like that. So this way you will actually get more done. And sometimes, especially if I'm pressed for time, I will actually just streamline my process like that. So I will first do all of the sketches for at least 1 episode, sometimes 2 or 3 episodes depending on, and then I'll do the same for the line, for color, for shading. I will do this step for the whole episodes or a few episodes first. And this actually works. I do manage to get a lot more done when I just break it down into those stages and get the whole comic done with that stage, instead of just working fully page by page. Because when you're going from a very beginning, sketching, lining, coloring, shading, the adding elements like bubbles and text and all of that, you have to switch between a lot of tools. Your mind have to switch as well. You need to think about, oh, okay, what I'm doing now. And if you do this for every single page, you will end up doing it way slower than if you were to just say do sketches for every single page in your episode and then do line art. Because actually at some point, if you keep doing this, you will start working on autopilot and it will be way faster. So once I'm happy with how my panels, the perspective, everything is laid out, I can now move to inking, or how I like to call it sometimes, line work. So I mainly draw my iPad and I use Procreate to do that. And something that I really like to have is whenever I'm working on a comic or something that is going to have a continuous repeating character designs or repetition of things, I like to create a separate color palettes for different characters, for different usage. So for example, in here, I didn't want to use black inking and black lining for my characters. That's why I decided to stick to brown. But if I didn't save my presets, I would have to go back and find this same brown every single time I'm working on a chapter, which is very inconvenient. So you really want to utilize your tools. If you have Procreate, that's a great tip. Definitely save your character colors. Of course, we do have a reference option where you can just have an image of your character right there on the screen, but at the same time I still find it much quicker if I save every color that goes to the character and I save my shading colors, my inking colors, everything, and organize it neatly. It will save me a lot of time, and that's why I'm telling you this right now, so that you can also start efficiently as well. You guys know that inking takes a while. Everybody have their own technique when it comes to inking. My technique is very simple. I'm just basically using it as a line art. That's why I call it line work, because inking in comics have a different techniques depending on if you're doing American comics or manga, depending on artist style and a lot of those details. But for me, I like to keep it simple, so I just make it a simple line. And as long as it's neat, as long as I keep it the same width, I mess with it too much. And again, I will do this process for the whole episode or a few episodes sometimes to save myself some time. And once all of the line work is done, I'm moving on to color. And I want to point out, you guys, that I have my background parallel and separated from line work, color, and shading, because my backgrounds is an entirely different process and I do them in the different stages. Sometimes I do them afterwards with just some understanding of perspective. Sometimes I do that in between. While I'm working on my line art, I might already come up with something for my background. So that just depends. But I'm gonna go ahead and talk about backgrounds in a little bit once we're done. So just so that you understand that in here, when I'm talking about all of those steps, I'm first talking about the character, not the backgrounds. And then I'm using my handy dandy palettes again so that I can make it quick, and I just basically color all of the characters. Something that I really love about Procreate is how easy it is to fill in a color. Because when I used to work in Photoshop on my very old comics back in the day, way before I had iPad, I used to have to color everything by hand, and I would have to do it myself, and oh my god, that was so much time for such a simple task. And that's why I really love Procreate, because it doesn't make me spend so much time, and I just fill it in. It has a reference layer, it's perfect. And yeah, this way I get it done quickly because I already have my shapes and everything. I just use my line art as reference, and then I just, you know, play the little coloring book game. on iPad. And yeah, of course there are some troubleshooting here and there from time to time, but honestly it's nothing compared to what the process used to be like, so I am very grateful that it's so easy now. And next we have shading. So when it comes to light and shadow and shading the panels, again, everybody have different process. Some people like to go a little OCD and go too far and go too detailed with that. And you can go ahead and have fun if you want to. But then again, you will be so much happier if you simplify this stage of the process as well. Basically try to keep it simple. So what I do when I'm working on a simple comic is I like to pick just one color that I'm going to use for shade. Just one color. So you don't have to look for color for your shade every single time you're working on a panel. Just pick one color. Here's the one I choose that you can see on my iPad. And then I just set the layer. I just use the shading layer. And then I adjust the opacity and draw. This way you can still get a great shadow. It will look natural on all of the colors. You don't really need to nitpick and pick colors for every single piece of clothing. Again, you can do that if you really want to, but if you want to save time, this is the best way to go because you still get great shadows, but at the same time you spend way less time doing it. And same goes for highlights. Actually, I don't always use highlights. It depends on the style that I'm doing. Like for example, in this comic, I'm actually not really using any highlights unless it's absolutely necessary, because highlights do tend to make it a little bit more rendered, which is not a bad thing. But again, in here, I want to keep it simple. I want to keep my style simple, but at the same time, aesthetically pleasant. So this is the style I went for. But if you want to have highlights, go ahead. You can do this at this stage as well. Just keep in mind that highlights, especially if you were already doing a detailed job of shading, well, by all means, it is your art, it is your artistic decision. You can totally do that. But if you want to save time and if you want to post every week and actually get more attention to your comic, I would recommend, especially if you're just starting out, to again keep it simple. If you want to play around with shadows, highlights, you can do it for things like your comic covers, illustrations, material that goes with it. You can even do something for like after the comic section, but I still recommend keeping it simple. So unless you have a part in your story where highlights are absolutely necessary, I would recommend just ditching them altogether. And of course, with highlights, we also have some effects, like visual effects. And thankfully, with digital art, it's so much easier to do. It's much more accessible. So if you do have some moments where you need some visual effects, like for example, you have some fire or something that needs to be glowing, you can also do that here in this part of the process. So by this stage, you should already have your characters that are drawn with colors and shades. And now we can actually discuss backgrounds, because I do prefer doing my backgrounds before I ever hit the element stage where we do the lettering, the sound bubbles, all of that, because I still want to have the full panel ready before I can do things on top. For backgrounds, I tried a lot of different things, because to be honest, backgrounds are not my favorite, but what a lot of artists tend to do is neglecting their backgrounds, and audience can tell, and that's like one of the most top pet peeves of people that are reading comics, is when there are not enough backgrounds and it's just characters all the time, or where backgrounds are just colors. A lot of people don't like that, unless of course you have one of those like comics where you only need a character and it can be just white background, like the ones that you see on Instagram. But that's a totally different animal. We're mainly talking about the storytelling kind of comics here. And luckily nowadays, with all of the technology, we have a lot of options to go about backgrounds, even if you're not great at backgrounds yourself. I am not great at backgrounds, I will tell you honestly. I did take a long time to learn how to do them. I hated learning perspective. That was my least favorite thing to learn, but especially for comics, you absolutely have to. Perspective. And when it comes to question how to do them, there are a lot of options nowadays. One of the things I used to do is I used to pick photo references. And I would pick them, I would use them, and then either draw on top of them. Like I wouldn't use the image itself, I would just outline them. So first I would use the image like an actual sketch, and then outline it, and then I would just draw it in the style of a comic. So this one works. I also had some super simple backgrounds with just some elements in the background. And that honestly largely depends on the style of your comic, because when I had a very cute anime, chibi, fun comedy comic, backgrounds didn't matter too much. I still had them, but they were super duper simple and they fit the art style, which is very important. Another thing that you can do is you can use 3D models. A lot of artists actually do use 3D models for their backgrounds. You can either again outline them and use them like a sketch and then draw on top. And when I say outline them, what I mean is you can trace them basically if you want to, or you can just use them as a reference. It's again up to you. Honestly, as long as it fits the purpose, as long as it makes sense in terms of style and everything for your comic, whatever way you choose is great. I don't necessarily recommend coming up with backgrounds just from your head. Try to still at least have some references, especially if your story taking place in a real world. Even if it's a fantasy world, they probably still have same rules of perspective if your character is walking on the ground, right? So make sure to at least have some references. And I would say unless your comic isn't super duper simple, cute, funny, chibi style, you should use some references. And last option, which I have actually talked about in my other video, is using the most up-to-date technology, because you guys know we live in the world of AI, and at least this is actually a place where we can use it that is helpful for the artist and use it as a tool, like I mentioned in this video over here. And I do believe that, honestly, I believe that it should be used only by artists and only as a tool, because it does help. It is very useful for us to speed up our process or help us out in many ways. It's just that the way it has been used, especially when they just released, wasn't very ethical. But here we are, we can take the power back. And well, something you can do for your comic actually is you can use AI to help you generate those backgrounds. And you can either use it as a reference or trace it or just use it directly in there. Another thing is check out my channel, because I know how we all feel about the shady part of how AI art came to be, how it was trained on other artists' works, which is not cool. And that's why I've made a video, which should by this point be released. I will link it down below. If it's not, I will link it down below when it is, where I teach you how to train AI model on your very own art, so that you don't have to feel guilty about using somebody else's work, and also especially if you want to keep your very own style. Then you can use this technique so that you're actually training the machine on your very own style, on your art, on not somebody else's. And then it will just help you produce exactly what you're looking for in terms of the style. Just feel better knowing that, you know, you are the main source for this information and you're not stealing from anybody else. So yeah, you can check out this video as well. I personally spent a very long time trying to understand AI art and how to use it as a tool, as an artist, so it wouldn't hurt anybody else, and so that it would actually help and not hurt, you know? And that's why I put together this video. And I actually only started using this in my own comic starting from episode 6, I believe, where I actually started using this technique where I trained the AI on my own style, and then I use it to generate backgrounds for me, which made it much easier for me, because even though you will still definitely have to fix a lot of things, but it's better than have a blank page, you know, and it's still original and it is trained on your work, so it is similar in terms of style. So you would have to, yes, you would have to still paint. Yes, you will most likely need to make adjustment and draw on top and fix some things, but at least you will already have a base to go from, which will be easier and faster as well. With that said, you absolutely do not have to use AI in your work or in your comic. This is just one of the ways, just like 3D models or all of those other techniques I described, it's just one of those. So take what you want from it. I'm just here to help and try to give you some ideas and share my knowledge and experience with it. Now that you have your background, your characters, everything, we're gonna add some elements, basically lettering, text, and sounds, which, by the way, you guys, try to avoid, when you're writing sounds, try to avoid writing action. For example, when a character opens the door, or if the heart is pumping, or do not write the door opens. This is actually another pet peeve that a lot of readers have. That's why I'm telling you guys, try to avoid this. Instead, if you're not sure how to sound, how to write out the sound for a certain thing, just try to Google it, because I'm sure you can find it in Google. If it hasn't been discussed, if it's such a unique sound, I don't know, like, what's the bed falling from the ceiling? I don't know, what's the bed falling from the second floor sounds like? Which is, again, not something that you should be sounding. This is just a ridiculous example. But the point is, now, even Google have basically ChatGPT plugged into it. So when you ask this question, even if nobody wrote article or discussed it, it will still give you some suggestion based on common sense. So if you're absolutely not sure how to write a certain sound, just Google it, seriously. And another good reason to research those sounds is because sometimes, depending on the country or language, they might differ. For example, did you know that in English, the heartbeat, we would write it out as thump thump? I did not know that until I googled. In Japanese, they would write doki doki, or in Korean, they would write tokum tokum, or in French, they would write, I think, boom boom, and Russian would say tuk tuk. So there's a lot of ways just this one sound can be interpreted. And another interesting thing is sometimes when comic artists translate manga, webtoon, or comic, they will actually translate this sound directly. So that's why sometimes you'll see like, oh, doki doki or dogom or something in your comic, is because they just translated the sound directly. But actually every language will have different sounds, especially when it's a common sound, like again, heartbeat. For the lettering, there are some people who like to just write the text by themselves. I'm not one of those people. No, thank you. You guys seen me write, I think. Especially when it comes to English, I don't know, I feel like my writing isn't that great. And also because if you do decide to make your own font, some artists just make their own font, which is, again, that's still better than writing everything by hand every time, because we are here to try to save some time and work efficiently, right? But if you do decide to make your very own font, make sure that it's, one, readable. Because something that us artists, something that creative people tend to do is make it beautiful and complicated and complex. But the problem is people cannot read it. And then you'll hear from your readers that they would love to read your story, but they can't because they can't understand the text. Or you can use a font from your general selection. I would say there are a few comic fonts that are more common, and that's actually something I would recommend using unless you absolutely hate it or you have something against it, or you just want your font to be very unique. Because again, our point here is to get the reader to read at ease. So if you can find a font which is more similar to the fonts that are usually used on a platform, especially when it's like manga, webtoon, or even traditional comic book, it will be much easier for the viewer. They don't need to get used to another font. And another thing is sometimes there are viewers who just get turned off by the font. If they feel the font is unpleasant to look at, they will not read the comic book. So in here, I would say you can be creative if you want to. It's absolutely up to you. But I still recommend, especially if this is your first time, just keep it simple. Stick to the fonts that are usually used in comic spaces or that looks more like it. And another thing is, try not to use different fonts too much. There are some people, they like to use one font here and this font there. And again, for viewer, this is very distracting. This is visually unpleasant. And also because they have to still switch a lot. For example, imagine Helvetica on your left and then some calligraphy on your right? It will be still tasking for you to do both. And it will distract you from the story. And we're trying to keep the viewer engaged in your story instead of dragging them out. So for that purpose, I would say try to keep the font the same, especially if it's just a dialogue. You can use some special fonts for special occasions. So for example, in my semi-realistic comic, The Blue Blood, I usually stick to one simple font unless there's like a special purpose to change the font. So I use that for my comic when it's like an announcement which is holographic, so my characters can actually see it and hear it. So this is more of like a visual representation so that people could tell like, oh, okay, this is a text that like characters are talking, but then this text here is actually something that characters can see and hear. So the whole point is that if you do want to use different font or even switch between like bold text and the regular text, or what is it called, italic, right? Make sure that there is a purpose. Make sure that you do this for a reason, and this reason is all about making viewers' experience more immersive, making their reading experience more pleasant. When it comes to speech bubbles as well, try to keep it simple, especially if it's a dialogue. I still like to keep it black text on white bubbles kind of thing, because then it's not distractive, people can focus on what is going on. But at the same time, if you want to use something else, something special, or you want to use different color for a purpose, then you can try. But again, it cannot be too distracting, because another comment I often hear from readers is that whenever comic is using too much color in their bubbles, like the color would change, or there is weird colors that the author is choosing, which messes up with reading experience, that's no bueno. So I recommend keeping it simple. You can see in my comic, in my semi-realistic comic, what I did is I keep it simple bubbles with the conversations, but then my thoughts, you can use a simple like the cloud bubble for the thoughts as well. But what I did for my thoughts is I use like a almost like actual cloud texture for it. So it's a little bit more artistic. And the most important part is people can still tell. As long as people can tell and it doesn't mess with a reading experience, you can try experimenting with things like that. But I just wouldn't go too crazy because again, we're trying to keep them focused on your story, not on your text. And finally, when you are done drawing your episode and it's all polished, nice and done, presentable, we can move to post-production. So for comics, I actually define post-production as part of the production pipeline where everything has been drawn, your process has been done for a few episodes. We're not talking the whole comic, but we're talking those few episodes. Although if you want to go ahead and just draw the whole comic first, go ahead. But then for post-production part, once you already have a few episodes done, we can move on to the next stage. And here's the thing, before you ever start posting, my greatest recommendation to you guys is because I know it can be so exciting, especially if you've been drawing this for a long time, you're so excited about the story, you love the way it looks, you're so, like, I'm always very passionate and excited about the project I'm working on. So all I want to do is just to show it to people and see what they think and share this story with the world, which is the reason I drew this at the first place, right? But one of the biggest advices that you will hear from any comic artist that has been doing this for a while is get a hold of yourself and do not immediately post an episode after you completed it. Why? You need a magical world called buffer. Yeah, so buffer is basically a certain quantity of extra episodes that you have, so that once you have a posting schedule, you can keep on schedule and keep posting consistently, which at this point you already know that any platform you're gonna be in loves consistency, and audience too. Viewers are used to getting their series, their comics, receiving the new episode at a certain day of the week, of a month, a certain date. They like to have this consistency because they feel reassured that, okay, on this day I will get to read this comic. And if you cannot deliver, it will cost you viewers. It will definitely put you on a less favored side of a platform, and less people will see your comic because of that. And so one big advice that every single comic artist I ever knew always tells me is that make sure before you start posting, you still got time. People don't know about your comic yet. Try and make buffer. The bigger, the better. Generally, from the estimate that I've asked around, people recommend doing at least between 10 to 15 episodes as a buffer, because what happens is in the very beginning, it is usually useful to release few episodes at a time, especially on platforms like if you're doing Webtoon and if you want to post on the Webtoon platform. There are a few different platforms that you can post on, but let's say you're posting on Tapas or Webtoon. What they like to do is they like to post free episodes right away. So you would first post free episodes at first and then start gradually posting the rest of them, like every week, every 2 weeks, whatever your schedule looks like. Twice a week, it just depends on the comic, it depends how often you want to post. But if you are not prepared, let's say you've only done those 3 episodes, once you post them, you will be done. First off, you're still getting used to drawing this comic, and you might not be as quick as you will be in the future when you're working on it. That's the first. But also at the same time, life happens. You don't know if maybe next week you will have a big event, hot date, I don't know, school, work. We're human, we have so much stuff going on, and what's gonna happen, you will either miss the deadline or you will yourself throughout the whole week to get it done, which is not good because it will quickly cause you to burn out. And again, burnout is no bueno, so let's make sure that you're staying healthy, mentally healthy. Most of all, this is not worth your mental health, believe me. So if you're really serious about this, and you really want to give this comic the best shot, make sure to have some buffer. Actually, the best practice I recommend is once you start working on those episodes, and that's actually another reason why 10 to 15 episodes is a good range, because during that time, you will figure out how long it usually takes you to make one episode. How many panels do you usually create per episode? How long does it last? how realistically, how often can you get episode done. So then once your buffer is done, for example, if you are sure that you need, let's say, a week or 3 days or less than a week to create an episode, and that's generally usually how long it takes you, that's good, because once you ran out of buffer, you can sustain this schedule, and it will also help you cater to the schedule that you like. Generally, comics that post more often succeed faster, that's true. But if your style is too complicated and you have to post once a week or twice a week, that might be not sustainable for you. So you should really see realistically how long does it take you. For example, my upcoming comic that you've seen in the example takes me about a week to complete. You know, plus minus depending, because sometimes I like to go ahead and make a longer episode, sometimes it's shorter. It depends on what makes sense in terms of storytelling. Sometimes it's better to end it earlier. Sometimes I actually spread it and give it more context. So it depends, but at the same time, I know that generally the good amount of time for me is 1 week, because then I'll have a little bit extra to do all of the post-production and everything, get everything done and polished before I publish or schedule my post. And especially if you want to post multiple times a week, usually that is only recommended for a super simple style. Usually it's a slice of life kind of comic or comics with a very few panels. Those can post multiple times a week. But generally, if you have a story-centered comic, whatever the genre is, and you are not working in a very, very, very simple style, I would not recommend that. I would say do at least once a week. But some of my friends who have been working for years and, you know, they're quite up there, they tell me how much they wish they would set their schedule up to be every 2 weeks. But to be fair, their style is quite detailed. It's not very simple. So, and they usually have to go on different hiatus just to keep their mental health in check. But you know, once you already set it, the expectation is set. And if you want your comic to succeed, and especially if you're eager and you want it to happen faster, I do recommend to stick into once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever consistency you can maintain. For example, for my semi-realistic comic, it takes me forever to make. It is forever, and the thing is, I can never even estimate how long the next chapter is gonna last me, because sometimes the chapters are really long, sometimes they're really short, but even short chapters take a long time. So I know that I will need at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a minimum for me, and that means I'm gonna be working on it every single night for hours to get something done. So make sure to be realistic. Take your time, assess your skills, assess your capabilities, see what you can really do in a period of time. And if you feel like a week is a good measure, then post once a week. If you feel like you can get like 3 episodes done in 1 week, if it's much simpler style or shorter chapters, whatever you want to do, then go ahead and post twice a week. But if you feel like, you know, your style is a little bit more detailed, it takes longer time, maybe stick to once in every 2 weeks or once a month, once every 3 weeks, just as long as it's realistic and you're not gonna burn yourself out. Because viewers understand, they know that you don't have the whole team of people behind you working on your comic. You're just one creator, just like me, just like many of us. And at this point, audience starts to understand that not every creator have a huge team behind them. And don't let people pressure you into posting more often. Just make sure that you're being very realistic about what you can realistically do. Yes, you will first grow slower. That is true, just because the platform will show your work less since it's only updates once a month. But if your work is good, if your story is good, you will gradually grow. So don't let this stop you. Because this way, as long as you are consistent, people will know, okay, this person updates every 20th of a month, or they update every 2 weeks. And so then they will come back in that time to check for your update, and you want to be sure that it's there. Now, you guys, earlier I mentioned that you should really make sure that, especially when you're working on this first, you should pick a format that you're going to be working in. So at this point, you already finished your episode or 2 or 3, however many. And at this point, you should already have it in one single format. And based on this format now, you should do your research and find a platform where you could be publishing your comics. And like I mentioned before, if you want to post on all of those platforms, you can absolutely do this. The only thing is you will need to reformat it. So at first, it's good practice to start with just 1 or 2, as long as it doesn't take you too much time. Because in here, we want to make sure that at first it's sustainable, it doesn't take too much of your time. Otherwise, you're just going to end up spending days and days reformatting comic that you spent a really long time on already. and eventually you will burn out from that as well. So make sure to keep it simple. For example, for me, I work in Webtoon format most of the time. So what I do is I post on vertical scroll platforms, and it's not that many of them, especially those that allow you to publish things yourself. One of them is Webtoon, the other one is Tapas. Those are two biggest ones. There is something called Lululun, I think, who reached out to me before, but I think they are kind of like you have to be their original in order to post. And it's a whole another thing. But if you want to be posting individually on your own terms, if you're posting Webtoon, you can check out Webtoon and Tapas. And the thing is, when I say pick a platform, I'm only going to do Webtoon and I'm not going to do Tapas. No, as long as it's the same format, you can do both. Because you do not owe any one of those platforms anything unless they reach out to you and offer to buy your series. That's another thing that we can discuss. If you want to talk about this, let me know in the comments. But in here, we just want to make sure that you're picking a platform that supports your format. So if it's a vertical scroll, find platforms with vertical scroll, which mainly in English right now, Webtoon and Tapas are two biggest ones. They already have an audience attached to it, so I would suggest starting from there. Tapas, Webtoon, and you can also have your own website and post on all of them. Because again, you don't owe anybody anything. And it is good to have readers on your own website because it is kind of your platform and you have control over it. But on the con side of things, you will have to pay for it, where Webtoon and Tapas is free and they already have audience included. And when you have your own website, you kind of have to bring audience there. So you could do both. It also depends on your social media following and like marketing, all of that stuff. But we'll get to it. There are many different platforms, especially when it comes to traditional comics. So you can just do your own research, see which ones are the most popular, which ones have a bigger user base and reader base. But also if you want me to make a video to compare like pros and cons, I can also do that for you guys. But yeah, make sure to choose your platform wisely, because the next step is going to be, before you start publishing there, you're gonna set up the page for your comic. Whatever platform is, usually you have to set up your very own page, you have to register, blah blah blah, but also you have to set up the page where there is a name for your comic, all of the posters, the materials, descriptions, things like that. So you will have to put in additional time to do that. And also, usually platforms will have their preference when it comes to resolution. You should be working on a big canvases if you can. But when it comes to posting on Tapas or Web, when you're actually posting, you don't need to post that big ass image. You actually, not even that you don't need to, you actually can't. Platform will not let you post something that big. They have a limit. So what you want to do is, little life hack, you can go to, what is it called? Hold on. Is it Croppy? Hold on. No sponsoring here, I just want to give them a shout out because it's such a useful tool and it's completely free. It's called Croppy, and they have an option for you to basically upload your images and then download them in a format for either Webtoon or Tapas or both, which is super useful. It's called Croppy and I will add it below. For traditional comics, you don't have to use tools like that. Usually you can just export them in a size that platform requires, since when it comes to vertical comics, the vertical scroll usually will cut certain parts of the image, but that doesn't happen with traditional comics and their platforms. Most of the time, at least, as far as I know. So for that, you can actually do this yourself. Just make sure to do your research when it comes to platform and read what kind of sizes they're looking for, if there is a limit, what's the preferred size and things like that. And now we're finally at publishing stage. Yes, you did it. You did your work. You have a buffer of 10 to 15 episodes, maybe even more. Maybe you even finished the whole series. If you did, that would be amazing. I don't think I know anybody who would finish series before they start publishing it, but if you did, that's amazing. So now you're ready to publish, and by now you should already have your platforms of choice. You can even have the pages for them set up in advance, so all you need to do is publish. And so now, before you hit publish, what you should do is figure out your posting schedule. Like we just discussed, you should really pick your schedule based on realistically how long it takes you to make an episode. Be realistic, assess your capabilities, and figure out how long. If it's once a week, let it be once a week, like every Monday, every Friday, whatever works for you. You can also do some more research and find out for this specific platform, what time do viewers usually go on it. Usually when you publish your comic on a platform, because those are comic publishing platforms, and what they do is they usually sort it out by the time. So the newest update will show up first. But here's the thing, if there are a lot of artists on this platform and you've picked a genre that's high in competition like romance per se, there is a good chance that you will only have maybe like less than an hour to be seen on that page, because there will be more and more comics coming basically every day, all the time. And again, in the popular genre, it can be every other minute or so. So you will gradually see your comic like go down on the page. So you want to pick a good time, because if you post US, I don't know, let's say 3 a.m. in San Francisco, and you want people in the US to read it, right? Then you'll have yourself a bit of a pickle, because people are gonna be sleeping at that time, and then by the time they wake up and start actually reading comics or go on the platform, your comic will be way down there, pushed by all of the other comics. So it's good to do research. I know for a fact that a lot of people recommend posting in the evening, but you can also do weekend, mornings, afternoons, you know. Again, think about who your audience is first. Are they going to school? Like, is this a teenage drama or something like love story? Or is it for teenage boys, some kind of action? Or is it more for older viewers, you know? Or opposite to that, you really want to think about who your audience is and think about, okay, what would be the time they would read that kind of thing? Maybe during their lunch break, right? Or maybe after school or work in the evening, which is, evening is usually more popular in terms of timing, but you should really do your research when it comes to platform and your audience. Try to understand who your audience is, what kind of people would be reading your comic. And then you can figure out the best time for you to post so that they can actually see your comic. In this sense, it kind of works a lot like social media nowadays, where you have to think about consistency, you have to pick the right time, you need to keep your target audience in mind. Unfortunately, all of those things do affect comics as well, because again, we are trying to find audience, and if you're posting on a platform which is not yours and they already have audience, they're not necessarily looking specifically for your comic, and you need to make sure that they see it. And that brings me to marketing, and specifically social media marketing, since this is going to be your biggest, most appreciated tool, and that's definitely something that you should use. There is a ton to learn about social media marketing, especially when it comes to art. I honestly feel like with all of my experience with social media, I should really make maybe series of videos on social media marketing when it comes to marketing your art and like your comics and things like that. I don't know if there's interest there, but if you want to see videos like that, do let me know. But social media marketing is so crucial, because whatever platform you choose to post your work at, generally platforms like that, they do like people coming from the outside, and if you bring people from the outside, the algorithm will push your work forward. Which is not to say that this is always the case, but it works like this for many platforms nowadays. And with that said, you should definitely work on building your social media, your art social media specifically. And especially if you have a comic that you're serious about, you can build your whole social media around it. Because today, in order to make any business or monetization, you will have to use one or two or multiple platforms to promote your work, and also to engage with your viewers, you know, be a YouTube channel or Instagram, or I don't know, do people still use Facebook for that? Because you are building a community and also building your very own fan base, so that people who are actually interested in your art, actually interested in your comic, when they're looking for stuff to get, maybe you decide to launch a series of t-shirts or stickers, or you want to print your comic, that's when you want to let those people know that this is what you're planning to do, and then you can find ways to monetize it and make it happen. I'm not gonna cover social media for artists in this video too much, just because it's such a wide topic. And like I say, if you are curious about this, you want to learn more, just tell me in the comments. I will do my best, maybe even do a video series, because it's such a wide topic and there is a lot to be said. I also have a few videos about growing on Instagram for artists on my channel, so you can go ahead and check it out. I have a lot of useful videos coming soon, so I hope you enjoyed this one. Stay tuned for my newest videos, and I will see you guys next time.